Sarah fidgeted nervously as she waited outside the imposing oak doors of Mr. Blackwood's office. After weeks of applying to every job listing she could find, this was her last hope. At 25, with mounting student loan debt and rent due, she desperately needed this position as a live-in caretaker, even if the ad had been frustratingly vague on details. The door creaked open, revealing a severe-looking older woman. "Mr. Blackwood will see you now," she said curtly before striding away down the hallway. Sarah entered the dimly lit office, her eyes drawn to the distinguished gentleman seated behind an antique desk. Though likely in his 60s, Mr. Blackwood cut an impressive figure, his salt and pepper hair neatly combed and his suit impeccably tailored. "Please have a seat, miss," he said, gesturing to the chair across from him. "Walker." "Sarah Walker," she replied, trying to keep her voice steady as she sat down. Mr. Blackwood nodded, studying her intently. "Tell me, Miss Walker, why should I entrust you with this position?" "It requires the utmost discretion and dedication." Sarah took a deep breath. "Sir, I can assure you that I am hardworking, responsible, and able to maintain strict confidentiality. I have experience in caregiving and—" He held up a hand, cutting her off. Yes, I'm sure you're quite qualified on paper, but this role involves unique challenges. Are you prepared to deal with unusual circumstances, Miss Walker?" She hesitated, unsure how to respond. I believe I can handle whatever the job entails, Mr. Blackwood." A slight smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. "Very well. You start tomorrow. My housekeeper, Mrs. Winters, will show you to your quarters and brief you on your duties." He slid a thick envelope across the desk. "Your contract. I suggest you read it carefully before signing." Speechless, Sarah could only nod as she gathered her things and left the office in a daze. What had she just agreed to? The next morning, Sarah lugged her suitcase up the sweeping driveway of Blackwood Manor. The sprawling Victorian mansion loomed before her, its windows like watchful eyes. Mrs. Winters answered her tentative knock, lips pursed in displeasure. "You're late," she snapped. "Come along, there's much to do." Sarah hurried after the housekeeper, trying to take in her surroundings as they wound through richly furnished rooms and up a grand staircase. Finally, they reached a plain door at the end of a long hallway. "These will be your quarters," Mrs. Winters said. "You are not to leave this wing of the house unless summoned. Is that clear?" Yes," Sarah stammered. "But what exactly are my duties? The contract was rather vague." Mrs. Winters fixed her with a stern glare. "You are here to care for young Master Edward. He requires special accommodations. You will bathe him, feed him, read to him, whatever he needs. But you must never, under any circumstances, remove his mask. Do you understand?" Before Sarah could respond, a blood-curdling shriek echoed through the house. Mrs. Winters sighed. "That would be Master Edward now. Come, I'll introduce you." Heart pounding, Sarah followed the housekeeper to a heavy oak door. Mrs. Winters produced an old-fashioned key from her apron pocket and unlocked it, revealing a dimly lit bedroom. A slight figure huddled in the corner, rocking back and forth. As they approached, Sarah saw it was a boy of perhaps 12 or 13, wearing silk pajamas and what appeared to be a burlap sack over his head. "Master Edward," Mrs. Winters said gently, "your new caretaker is here. This is Miss Walker." The boy's head snapped up at the sound of Sarah's name. Though she couldn't see his face, she felt the weight of his gaze upon her. Hello, Edward," Sarah said, kneeling down to his level. "It's nice to meet you." Edward remained silent, his masked face tilted quizzically. After a long moment, he extended a pale, slender hand towards her. Sarah took it hesitantly. "Well, I'll leave you to get acquainted," Mrs. Winters said. "Ring the bell if you need anything." With that, she departed, locking the door behind her. Sarah turned back to Edward, unsure what to do next. To her surprise, he tugged on her hand, pulling her towards a bookshelf in the corner. "Would you like me to read to you?" she asked. Edward nodded enthusiastically. And so began Sarah's strange new life at Blackwood Manor. Day after day, she cared for the masked boy, reading him stories, playing games, and tending to his needs. Though he never spoke, Edward proved to be bright and affectionate in his own way. Sarah found herself growing oddly protective of her young charge. She couldn't help but wonder what secrets lay behind that ever-present mask. What tragedy or deformity was Mr. Blackwood hiding from the world? Weeks passed, and Sarah settled into a routine. She rarely saw Mr. Blackwood or any other staff besides Mrs. Winters. The rest of the mansion remained a mystery, with many wings cordoned off and certain rooms always locked. One night, Sarah was jolted awake by the sound of breaking glass. Concerned, she crept out of bed and made her way to Edward's room. To her horror, the door was ajar and the room empty. Panic rising in her throat, Sarah raced down the hallway, calling Edward's name. A muffled sob from behind a closed door caught her attention. She tried the handle, but it was locked. "Edward? Are you in there? It's me, Sarah. Please open the door." After a moment of silence, she heard the click of the lock. Sarah rushed inside to find Edward huddled on the floor, shards of a broken mirror scattered around him. His mask was askew, revealing a glimpse of what lay beneath. Sarah gasped. Instead of the monstrous deformity she had imagined, she saw only smooth, pale skin, unmarred save for a small birthmark near his eye. "Oh, Edward," she breathed. "Why do they keep you hidden away like this? There's nothing wrong with you." As she reached out to comfort him, the door burst open. Mr. Blackwood stood in the doorway, his face a mask of fury. "What have you done?" he roared. "You were expressly forbidden from removing his mask." I didn't," Sarah stammered. "It was already—" "Silence!" Mr. Blackwood bellowed. "You've ruined everything. Mrs. Winters, escort Miss Walker off the premises immediately. She is no longer employed here." Sarah found herself unceremoniously ejected from Blackwood Manor, her belongings tossed out after her. As the iron gates clanged shut behind her, she vowed to herself that this wasn't over. She would uncover the truth behind Edward's captivity, no matter the cost. The next few weeks were a blur of sleepless nights and fruitless investigations. Sarah scoured newspaper archives and public records, searching for any clue about the Blackwood family's past. But it seemed they had gone to great lengths to erase their history. Just when she was about to give up hope, Sarah received an unexpected visitor. Mrs. Winters appeared on her doorstep one rainy evening, looking haggard and afraid. "You must help us," the housekeeper pleaded. "Things have gotten worse since you left. Mr. Blackwood, he's not well, and young Edward is in danger." Sarah's heart raced. "Tell me everything." Mrs. Winters took a shaky breath. "It all started 13 years ago. Mr. Blackwood's wife died in childbirth, Edward's birth. He was beside himself with grief, convinced the boy was cursed. When the birthmark appeared near Edward's eye, looking uncannily like his late wife's signature, Mr. Blackwood became obsessed with the idea that his son was possessed by her spirit." Sarah listened in horror as Mrs. Winters recounted years of isolation and pseudo-exorcisms inflicted on the innocent child. Mr. Blackwood's grip on reality had apparently slipped further in recent weeks, and she feared for Edward's safety. "We have to get him out of there," Sarah said firmly. "Tonight." Under cover of darkness, Sarah and Mrs. Winters crept back into Blackwood Manor through a servant's entrance. They made their way silently through the house, pausing at every creak and shadow. Finally, they reached Edward's room. Sarah's heart sank when she saw it was empty. "The attic," Mrs. Winters whispered. "He keeps all of his occult paraphernalia up there. Hurry." They raced up the narrow attic stairs, bursting through the door at the top. The scene that greeted them was like something from a nightmare. Edward was strapped to a table in the center of a chalk pentagram, candles flickering ominously around him. Mr. Blackwood loomed over the boy, chanting in some arcane language as he brandished a wicked-looking dagger. "Stop!" Sarah cried. "You'll kill him." Mr. Blackwood whirled to face them, his eyes wild. "You don't understand. I have to free him from her influence. It's the only way." "She's not possessing him," Sarah pleaded. "Edward is your son, your own flesh and blood. Please don't hurt him." For a moment, doubt flickered across Mr. Blackwood's face. Then his expression hardened once more. "Number. You're trying to trick me. I won't let you stop me from saving my boy." He lunged forward, dagger raised. Without thinking, Sarah threw herself between Mr. Blackwood and Edward. She felt a searing pain in her side as the blade found its mark. Sarah crumpled to the ground, dimly aware of the chaos erupting around her. Mrs. Winters wrestling the dagger away from Mr. Blackwood, Edward breaking free from his bonds, sirens wailing in the distance. As darkness closed in, Sarah felt a small hand grip hers tightly. Edward's face swam into view above her, tears streaming down his unmasked cheeks. "Sarah," he whispered, speaking for the first time. "Please don't leave me." She managed a weak smile. "I'm not going anywhere, kiddo, I promise." Sarah drifted in and out of consciousness, vaguely aware of being lifted onto a stretcher and loaded into an ambulance. The steady beeping of hospital machinery gradually pulled her back to awareness. She opened her eyes to find Edward curled up in a chair beside her bed, sound asleep. Mrs. Winters dozed in another chair nearby. A nurse entered, smiling when she saw Sarah was awake. "You're a very lucky young woman," she said softly. "The knife missed any vital organs. You should make a full recovery." Sarah nodded, wincing at the movement. "What happened?" "Where's Mr. Blackwood?" The nurse's expression grew somber. "He's been taken into custody. The police are still investigating, but it seems he'll be facing some serious charges." As if summoned by their conversation, 2 police detectives entered the room. They questioned Sarah gently about the events leading up to that night, jotting down notes as she recounted her strange tenure at Blackwood Manor. "You've been through quite an ordeal," one of the detectives said. "But thanks to your bravery, we were able to uncover years of abuse and neglect. Edward will be placed with a loving foster family while we sort everything out." Sarah's heart clenched at the thought of being separated from the boy she'd grown to care for so deeply. As if sensing her distress, Edward stirred in his chair. His eyes flew open, immediately seeking out Sarah's face. "You're awake," he cried, rushing to her bedside. "I was so scared. I thought I'd lost you too." Sarah reached out to smooth his tousled hair. "I told you I wasn't going anywhere, remember? Everything's going to be okay now." The detectives exchanged a meaningful look. "Actually," one of them said, "we may have a solution that would benefit everyone involved." Over the next few weeks, as Sarah recovered in the hospital, a flurry of legal proceedings took place. Mr. Blackwood was deemed unfit to care for Edward and stripped of his parental rights. With no other living relatives, Edward faced an uncertain future in the foster care system. But Sarah refused to let that happen. Despite her young age and lack of resources, she petitioned the court to become Edward's legal guardian. With glowing character references from Mrs. Winters and her own unwavering determination, Sarah's request was eventually granted. 6 months later, Sarah unlocked the door to a modest apartment across town from Blackwood Manor. "Welcome home," she said, ushering Edward inside. The boy looked around in wonder at the cozy living room with its overstuffed couch and cheerfully painted walls, a far cry from the oppressive gloom of his former prison. "This is really ours?" Edward asked, his voice filled with awe. Sarah nodded, smiling. "It's not much, but it's a fresh start for both of us. Now, how about we unpack and then order a pizza to celebrate?" As they settled into their new life together, Sarah marveled at the twist of fate that had brought them to this point. She had entered Blackwood Manor desperate for a job, never imagining she would leave with a new family and sense of purpose. Edward flourished under Sarah's care, slowly emerging from his shell. He started attending school, making friends, and even joined a local theater group. The birthmark that had caused his father so much anguish became barely noticeable as Edward's animated expressions lit up his face. There were still challenges, of course. Edward suffered from nightmares and anxiety attacks, relics of his traumatic past. But Sarah was always there to comfort him, reminding him that he was safe and loved. As for Sarah, she discovered a passion for child advocacy work. Her experience with Edward inspired her to help other children escape abusive situations and find loving homes. She went back to school part-time to earn a degree in social work, determined to make a difference. Years passed, and the wounds inflicted by Blackwood Manor slowly healed. Sarah and Edward's bond grew stronger with each passing day, evolving from caretaker and ward to something more akin to mother and son. On Edward's 18th birthday, they decided to visit Blackwood Manor one last time. The once grand estate had fallen into disrepair, its grounds overgrown and windows boarded up. As they stood before the rusted gates, Edward slipped his hand into Sarah's. "Thank you," he said softly, "for saving me, for everything." Sarah squeezed his hand, feeling a lump form in her throat. "No, thank you," she replied. "You saved me too, in more ways than you know." They turned away from the crumbling mansion, leaving the painful memories behind. As they walked towards their car and the bright future ahead, Sarah knew that they had both found something far more valuable than any material wealth. They had found a family in each other. The faded "for sale" sign swayed gently in the breeze as Sarah and Edward drove away from Blackwood Manor for the last time. The house that had once been a source of so much pain and fear now seemed small and insignificant in the rearview mirror. Life continued to unfold in beautiful and unexpected ways for the unlikely family Sarah and Edward had forged. Sarah completed her degree in social work and quickly made a name for herself in the field of child advocacy. Her first-hand experience with Edward's case gave her unique insight into the challenges faced by abused and neglected children. Edward, for his part, discovered a talent for writing. The imagination that had once been his only escape from his father's cruelty now poured forth onto the page in vivid stories of adventure and triumph over adversity. By his early 20s, he had published his first novel to critical acclaim. Their little family expanded over the years. Sarah married a kind-hearted teacher named David, who embraced Edward as his own. They went on to have 2 daughters, giving Edward the loving siblings he had always longed for as a child. But they never forgot where their journey together had begun. Each year on the anniversary of Edward's rescue, he and Sarah would volunteer at a local shelter for abused children. They shared their story of hope and healing, showing others that it was possible to overcome even the darkest of beginnings. As Edward grew into a confident and compassionate young man, Sarah marveled at how far they had come. The scared, silent boy in a burlap mask was now a beacon of light for others, struggling to find their way out of the shadows. One crisp autumn day, as they walked through a park near their home, Edward turned to Sarah with a thoughtful expression. "I've been thinking about Blackwood Manor," he said, "about what it represented and how it shaped both our lives." Sarah nodded, encouraging him to continue. "I want to buy it," Edward declared. "I want to turn it into a safe haven for kids like I was, somewhere they can heal and learn to trust again." Sarah's eyes widened in surprise. "Are you sure about this, Edward? That place holds so many painful memories for you." Edward nodded, his expression resolute. "Exactly, and that's why I want to transform it into something positive. We can't erase the past, but we can use it to build a better future." Sarah felt a swell of pride as she looked at the man Edward had become. "If this is what you want, then I'm behind you 100%, she said, pulling him into a tight hug. The process of acquiring and renovating Blackwood Manor was not without its challenges. The property had fallen into severe disrepair, and the local community was wary of its dark history. But Edward's vision and Sarah's expertise in child welfare slowly won people over. They enlisted the help of architects, therapists, and child development experts to design a space that would be both healing and nurturing. The gloomy corridors were opened up to let in natural light, and the overgrown gardens were transformed into peaceful outdoor spaces for play and reflection. As the renovation neared completion, Edward stood in what had once been his father's study, now a bright, welcoming room filled with books and comfortable seating. He ran his hand along the freshly painted walls, marveling at how different it felt. "Are you okay?" Sarah asked softly, coming to stand beside him. Edward smiled, his eyes shining with unshed tears. "I'm more than okay. For the first time, I feel like I'm truly free of this place's hold on me." The day of the grand opening arrived, and a crowd gathered outside the newly christened Blackwood Haven. Edward, looking dapper in a suit, stood at the podium to address the assembled guests and media. "Many of you know the story of what happened in this house," he began, his voice strong and clear. "But today marks the beginning of a new chapter. Blackwood Haven will be a place of refuge, of healing, and of hope for children who have known too much darkness in their young lives." As Edward continued his speech, Sarah watched from the sidelines, her heart swelling with pride and love. She thought back to that fateful day when she had first walked through the gates of Blackwood Manor, desperate for a job. Never in her wildest dreams could she have imagined where that decision would lead. The first group of children arrived at Blackwood Haven a week later. Sarah and Edward were there to greet them, along with a carefully selected staff of therapists, teachers, and caregivers. As the children explored their new home, Sarah noticed one little girl hanging back, her eyes wide with fear. Kneeling down to the child's level, Sarah spoke gently. "It's okay to be scared. This is all new and different, but I promise you, you're safe here." The little girl looked up at Sarah, then over at Edward, who was showing some of the other children around. "Did you used to be scared too?" she asked in a small voice. Sarah nodded. "I was. And so was Edward. But we learned that it's okay to be scared sometimes, as long as you don't let the fear stop you from moving forward." As the days turned into weeks and months, Blackwood Haven flourished. Children who had arrived withdrawn and mistrustful began to open up, to play, to laugh. The sound of joyful voices echoed through halls that had once known only silence and sorrow. Edward threw himself into the work, drawing on his own experiences to connect with the children in a way that few others could. He started a creative writing program, encouraging the kids to express their feelings through stories and poetry. Sarah, meanwhile, used her connections in the child welfare system to ensure that Blackwood Haven received the support and resources it needed to thrive. She also became a mentor to many of the young staff members, sharing her wisdom and experience. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset, Edward turned to Sarah with a smile. "You know, I've been thinking about writing a book about all of this. About us, about Blackwood Haven, about the journey from darkness to light." Sarah squeezed his hand. "I think that's a wonderful idea. Your story could help so many people understand the impact of childhood trauma and the power of love and perseverance to overcome it." As Edward began work on his book, he and Sarah reflected on the twists and turns that had brought them to this point. They had faced unimaginable challenges, but had emerged stronger for having faced them together. The years continued to pass, and Blackwood Haven grew in both size and reputation. What had started as a single house now encompassed several buildings on the sprawling grounds, each dedicated to a different aspect of healing and growth. Edward's book, Unmasking the Past, became a bestseller, shining a light on the often hidden world of child abuse and the long road to recovery. He used the proceeds to establish a scholarship fund for former residents of Blackwood Haven who wished to pursue higher education. Sarah, now in her 50s, began to step back from the day-to-day operations of Blackwood Haven, confident in the capable hands of the next generation of caregivers and advocates. She focused instead on policy work, using her experience to push for reforms in the child welfare system. As they celebrated the 20th anniversary of Blackwood Haven's opening, Sarah and Edward stood together, surveying the grounds filled with laughing children and dedicated staff members. "Did you ever imagine it would turn out like this?" Edward asked, a note of wonder in his voice. Sarah shook her head, smiling. "Never in a million years, but I'm so grateful it did." They thought back to that night in the attic, when everything had hung in the balance. How close they had come to a very different ending. But fate, courage, and the unbreakable bond between them had written a different story. Blackwood Manor, once a place of darkness and secrets, had been transformed into a beacon of hope. And Sarah and Edward, once a desperate job seeker and a masked, voiceless child, had found in each other the family they had always longed for. As the sun set on another day at Blackwood Haven, Sarah and Edward knew that their work was far from over. There would always be more children in need of love and healing, more battles to fight against the forces that sought to harm the vulnerable. But they were ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead, armed with the strength of their experiences and the power of their unwavering bond. For in each other they had found not just family, but a purpose greater than themselves, a legacy of love that would endure long after they were gone. And so, as night fell over Blackwood Haven, the lights in the windows shone bright, a promise of safety, of healing, and of hope for all who found their way there. The once forbidding mansion stood as a testament to the transformative power of love and the indomitable spirit of those who refused to let the darkness win.